The wave that took her boat was taller than the mast, and I saw it from the deck of my own vessel with my heart already in my throat before the hull went over. I had been standing at the rail in the black roar of that November gale for no better reason than that I could not sleep, and so I alone among the men of the Aurelia saw the small craft rise on the crest, hang for one impossible moment against the lightning, and vanish. I did not think. I have gone over that night 1,000 times since, turning it in my hands like a stone I cannot put down, and I still cannot tell you that there was a single thought in my head before I was over the rail and into the black water. My first mate, Hollies, swears he heard me shout something about the keeper's light, but I remember no words, only the cold that struck me like a blow and the certainty, absolute and wordless, that somewhere beneath that heaving dark a woman was drowning, and that I would not stand at a rail and watch it happen. They tell me now that a duke does not leap from his own ship into a killing sea for a stranger he has never met. They tell me it was madness, that I might have died for nothing, that Fenmore would have passed to my cousin Reginald, a man whose notion of estate management extends to complaining about the weather from the comfort of a card room. I have heard all of this, from my steward, from my aunt, from men who call themselves my friends. I did not care then, and I do not care now. I would do it again, before I had finished drawing the breath to decide against it. Her name was Wren Calloway, though I did not know that yet as I struck out through water that seemed to want to beat the very shape out of me. I had seen only a shadow, a shape, a boat going over, and then, for 3 strokes that felt longer than the whole of my life to that point, nothing at all. I thought I had lost her. I thought the sea had already finished what it started, and that I would come up gasping into a darkness with nothing in it but wreckage and rain. Then I heard her. It was not a scream. I want to be clear about that, because everyone who has asked me about that night since assumes it must have been a scream, the sort of high, helpless cry that belongs to the damsels in the old ballads my nurse used to sing me. It was not that. It was a shout, hoarse and furious, aimed not at heaven but at the sea itself, as though she were arguing with it, as though she fully intended to win. I have never in my life been so glad to hear anyone sound so angry. I found her clinging to a spar of her own shattered boat, one hand locked around the splintered wood with a grip that would leave bruises for a week, the other beating at the water to keep her face above the waves. Her hair had come loose from its pins and lay across her face like a drowned thing, and even in that darkness, even with death close enough to touch us both, I could see she was still trying to look toward the rocks, toward the light, toward the ship she had gone out to save, not toward any rescue for herself. "There's a ship on the rocks course," she gasped, when I got an arm under hers. "Not thank you. Not help me. A ship on the rocks course, as though I were a hand come to relieve her at an hour past shift change, as though the matter of her own drowning were secondary to business not yet concluded. Have they turned? Have they seen the light?" "They've seen it," I said, though I had no earthly idea whether they had, and hauled her against me as a wave broke over both our heads and tried to tear her from my arms. Hold to me and stop shouting at the ocean, madam. It isn't listening." She let out a sound that might, in calmer water, have been a laugh. I will not pretend the swim to the rocks was anything but the hardest thing I have ever done with my body. The sea did not want to give her up, and it did not want to give me up either, and there were moments when I believed we would both go down together, a duke and a keeper's daughter tangled at the bottom of a bay that did not care what either of us had been. I remember the taste of salt and blood where I had bitten my own tongue. I remember her fingers digging into my shoulder hard enough to leave marks, not in panic but in pure animal determination to live. I have been in battle. I have never been so frightened, and I have never fought so hard for anything, as I fought that night to get the 2 of us to stone that would not move beneath us. We found the rocks below the headland by luck as much as swimming, a shelf of black stone that the tide had not yet fully claimed, and I put her onto it before I let myself think about my own arms, which by then had gone past aching into something closer to numbness. She did not thank me there either. She turned, the moment she had a handhold, and looked back out at the black water, searching it. And I understood then that whatever else was true of her, she had not gone out into that storm for her own sake, and she was not done worrying over the ship until she knew it was safe. "It struck," she said, not a question, grief plain and immediate in a voice gone raw from shouting into wind. "I felt it. I felt the boat go, and I knew I hadn't reached them in time." "You don't know that," I said, though I could see nothing beyond the rocks but foam and dark. "You did everything a person could do." "That has never once been enough," she said, "on a night like this." And there was such old, weary knowledge in it that I understood I had washed up not merely against a brave girl, but against someone who had measured the sea's cruelty before and found her own courage wanting against it, more than once, and had gone out anyway. We spent what remained of that night wedged into a crevice of rock too narrow for either of us to lie down properly, her back against the stone and my body between her and the wind, because there was nothing else in that place that could serve as shelter, and no dignity left to either of us to pretend. We did not need each other's warmth to survive till dawn. I did not embrace her out of anything but necessity. At first, my coat around her shoulders, my arms about her, because two bodies together lose the cold slower than one alone. But necessity has a way of becoming something else when you are both shaking and neither of you says a word of complaint. And somewhere in those hours I stopped thinking of her as a stranger I had pulled from the sea and started thinking of her as a person whose heartbeat I could feel against my own ribs, and whose survival had become, quite without my permission, the only thing in the world that mattered to me. "You're a fool," she told me once, teeth chattering so hard the words came out broken. "Jumping from a ship in that sea, you might have drowned for nothing." "I am aware," I said. "Who does that?" "A man who couldn't watch," I said, "and live with himself after." She was quiet a long moment, studying me in what little gray light had begun to bleed into the sky at the edge of the world. "That's a foolish reason too," she said, but softer, and I understood it was not an insult, not entirely. "I've been told I have several foolish qualities," I said. "Watching people drown is apparently not one I intend to correct." I felt, rather than saw, the shape of a smile against my shoulder, and something in my chest that had been clenched tight since the moment I saw her boat go over eased, just slightly, just enough that I could believe we might both live to see whether either of us meant what we'd said. They found us at first light, my own men, half mad with worry. In a launch they should not have risked in that surf, but did anyway because Hollies, bless the stubborn old sailor, refused to accept that his Duke had died 200 yards from his own deck. I do not remember much of being lifted from the rocks, except that I would not let go of her hand until I was entirely certain other hands had a firm hold of her, and that when they finally pulled us apart to carry us to the boat separately, she looked back at me with an expression I could not name then and have spent considerable time naming since. It was not gratitude, precisely. It was something closer to recognition, as though she had taken my measure in that crevice of rock and found, to her own visible surprise, that I had passed some private examination she had not expected any man of my rank to pass. The ship, I learned within the hour, had turned in time. Not because of anything I had done. I want to be honest in this account, because I think honesty is owed to her memory and to the truth of that night, but because of her. Because Wren Calloway had gone out in a boat no larger than a rowboat, in a sea that had already claimed better sailors than either of us, to put herself between a merchant vessel and the rocks that would have broken it apart, and she had done it not for reward or recognition, but because it was the work in front of her and her father lay fevered and unable to do it himself, and there was no one else. I did not know all of that yet. I only knew, as they carried her up the cliff path to the Lighthouse cottage, with the dawn coming gray and merciless over a sea gone strangely calm, as though ashamed of itself, that I intended to follow her the entire way, and that nothing short of my own death was going to convince me to leave her side until I knew, with my own eyes, that she meant to live. The lighthouse stood at the tip of a headland called Gull's Point, a squat white tower with a keeper's cottage huddled at its base. The doctor who came from the village, a dry, capable man named Orset who had clearly seen enough shipwrecks in his years there to have stopped being impressed by them, pronounced her fortunate. A wrenched shoulder, a great quantity of bruising, a fever that came on by evening and worried him more than he said aloud, and a cut along her hairline that would scar, faintly, in a way I confess I found unbearably moving every time I saw it afterward, because it seemed to me a mark of everything she had survived rather than any diminishment of her. I would not leave. I want to set that down plainly, because it became, in the days that followed, a matter of considerable scandal in a corner of the country that did not have a great deal else to discuss. A duke does not sit at a sickbed in a lighthouse keeper's cottage, does not sleep in a hard chair with his boots still damp from the sea, does not spend 3 days unshaven in borrowed shirts too small through the shoulders, refusing every suggestion that he remove himself to more comfortable lodgings in the village. I did all of these things, and I would do them again, because I had held that woman against the cold and felt her decide, with every shaking breath, to keep living, and I was not going to be the sort of man who walked away the moment it became convenient to do so. Her father, Josiah Calloway, was himself abed in the next room, worn thin by a wasting illness that had kept him from the light for 2 months, and had made his daughter, at not yet 23, the sole keeper of Gull's Point in all but the official record. I learned this from the woman who came in daily to help with the nursing, a broad, blunt person named Mrs. Pargeter who eyed me for the better part of a day before deciding I was not, in fact, going to be any trouble, and then talked to me as freely as if I had always belonged in that kitchen. She's tended that light every night for 2 months, Mrs. Pargeter told me, kneading bread with the ferocity of a woman who had opinions about everything and intended to share most of them. Climbed those stairs in weather that would have you or me huddled by the fire, and never once complained, and never once told the Trinity men her father was too ill to hold his post, because she knew well enough what they'd do if they learned a girl was minding the light alone. What would they do? Take it from them, she said, without looking up. Give the post to some man with a family to feed and put the Calloways out to fend for themselves, likely as not, illness or no illness. She's kept that secret longer than she's kept anything else in her life, Your Grace, and now half the county's talking about the night she near drowned herself over it, and I don't imagine she's pleased. I found, sitting there with flour dust settling over the worn table and the sound of the sea always present beyond the walls like a held breath, that I admired her more with every fact I learned, and that the admiration had already curdled, somewhere in the crossing, into something with sharper edges and a longer reach. She woke properly on the 2nd day, the fever broken, and the first thing she did before she asked after her father, before she asked how long she'd been abed, was try to get up. The light, she said, already pushing back the blanket with her good arm, wincing at what the movement cost her injured shoulder. It wants trimming. It'll have wanted trimming since what hour is it, what day? The light has been tended, I said, catching her hand before she could do herself further harm, and found myself absurdly gratified by the fact that she let me hold it a moment longer than strictly required by the argument. Your man Tolliver came up from the village. He says you trained him yourself, and he's furious you doubted him even from a sickbed. That at least won a huff of something like laughter, quickly swallowed by a wince as she settled back against the pillow. You've been here the whole time, she said, studying me with an attention that made me feel, not for the first time, entirely transparent. They said Mrs. Pargeter said a duke had taken up residence in Papa's good chair and would not be moved. Mrs. Pargeter exaggerates only slightly. Why? It was, I would learn, entirely characteristic of her to ask the question so plainly. Without any of the arch delicacy, a lady of the ton would have wrapped around the same inquiry. I found I did not have a ready answer that did not sound, even to my own ear, either grandiose or foolish. "Because I pulled you out of that water," I said finally, "and some part of me has not yet believed you're safely out of it until I see you standing on your own 2 feet again. I am aware that is not a duke's usual behavior. I find I do not much care." She looked at me a long moment, and something in her face, wary, assessing, not at all overwhelmed by rank or title, which I confess I had never before encountered in a woman under my own roof or anyone else's, seemed to settle into a kind of grudging acceptance. "You'll want a better chair then," she said, "if you mean to make a habit of sitting in that one. It creaks." I laughed. I do not think I had laughed freely, without calculation, in longer than I could easily remember, and the sound of it surprised us both. The gentry came, of course, within the week. Once word had traveled the coast road the way word always does in places where nothing much happens and everything is therefore of enormous interest. Lady Southerton arrived first, ostensibly to bring calf's foot jelly for the invalid, in truth to see with her own eyes whether the rumor could possibly be true that the Duke of Fenmore, the Ironbark Duke, as men had taken to calling me since my father's death, for reasons having to do with a wood as unyielding as the man who bore the name, and I had never much minded the epithet until I began to wonder what a keeper's daughter would make of it, had installed himself in a Lighthouse cottage at the bedside of a woman with salt still in her hair. "How very singular," Lady Southerton said, in the cottage's small front room, looking at me over the rim of her teacup as though I were an exhibit at a fair. "One does not often see a peer of the realm so devoted to forgive me, my dear, I do not mean to give offense, a working woman's recovery." "I do not offend easily," Wren said, from the chair by the window where she had insisted on sitting up despite Orset's objections, her injured arm in its sling, her chin at an angle I was coming to recognize as a warning. "Though I confess I'm curious what word you had settled on before you reached for that one." Lady Southerton's teacup paused halfway to her lips. I bit down hard on the urge to laugh outright, and instead said mildly, "I imagine her ladyship meant no more than what she said, and I imagine my presence here requires no more explanation than the plain fact of it. Miss Calloway saved a merchant vessel and near 30 souls aboard it at the cost of her own safety. I consider it no great scandal that I should wish to see her fully recovered before I return to my own affairs." Of course," Lady Southerton said, in the tone of a woman entirely unconvinced and delighted to have fresh material for her correspondence. She did not stay long after that. There were others. A Mr. Prout, who owned the largest house in the village and imagined his opinion on the propriety of dukes and lighthouse keepers of great interest to everyone present, and a pair of sisters who came twice under transparent pretexts, attempting to discover whether I might be persuaded to remove to their brother's house for more comfortable lodging, an offer I declined each time with what I hoped was courtesy. Wren bore all of it with a composure I found remarkable, given that she was still recovering from injuries that would have kept a less stubborn person entirely abed. She answered impertinent questions with a directness that left the impertinent visibly wrong-footed, and she never once, in my hearing, apologized for the accident of her birth or the nature of her work, though I came to understand, in quieter moments between us, that the visits cost her more than she let anyone see. "They think I contrived it," she said to me one evening, when the cottage had emptied of callers and the fire had burned down to embers, and the only sound beyond the walls was the long, patient breathing of the sea, "that I capsized my own boat to draw a duke's attention, as though I have ever in my life had the leisure to contrive anything more elaborate than getting the lamp lit before dark." "No one who has spent an hour in your company could believe that," I said. "Anyone foolish enough to believe it is not worth the trouble of correcting." "You correct them anyway. I've watched you do it." "I have my own foolish qualities," I said, and was rewarded with the smile I had begun, entirely without my own permission, to arrange my days around. It was in those quiet hours, after the Gawkers had gone and her father had been settled for the night, and Mrs. Pargeter had gone home to her own cottage, that I came to know her truly, and the knowing undid, one by one, every assumption I had carried up that cliff path with my boots still full of seawater. I had assumed, without ever examining the assumption closely, that a woman rescued from drowning would be grateful in a manner that made her pliable, eager to defer to the man who had saved her. I had assumed, further back than that a duke rescuing a woman of no particular rank was performing a kindness that placed her forever in his debt, a transaction as old as the ballads and just as lopsided. Wren Calloway was not grateful in any manner that resembled deference, and she was in no one's debt, least of all mine. She asked me, within days of waking, sharp practical questions about the Fenmore coastline, whether my agents had ever surveyed the currents near Aldous Shoal, whether I understood that half the wrecks along that stretch of coast in the last decade could have been prevented by a second light where none currently stood. She corrected my understanding of tides with the patient exasperation of a woman long accustomed to explaining the sea to men who thought they already knew it, and I found myself, for the first time in longer than I could say, wanting very much to prove I was worth the trouble of teaching. "You keep looking at me as though I've said something remarkable," she told me one night, catching me watching her over the chessboard I had produced from somewhere in my own ship's stores, a small absurd vanity I had insisted on having brought up from the Aurelia because I could not bear another evening with nothing to occupy our hands while we talked. "You have," I said. "You said the currents off Aldous run counter to the tide 2 hours before the turn, which I did not know, and which apparently every keeper on this coast has known for generations, and which no one has ever thought to tell the man who owns the cliffs above it." "Would you have listened before?" she asked, moving a pawn with the unhurried confidence of someone who had learned the game from a father with long winter evenings and nothing else to teach her. "Before the water? Would you have sat in a lighthouse kitchen and let a keeper's daughter tell you your own coastline?" I considered lying to her briefly and then abandoned the idea, because I had already learned that she saw through polite fictions the way she saw through fog by long practice, and without much patience for the exercise. "No," I said, "I don't think I would have. I think I would have thanked you for your trouble and had my agent write it down and never thought of you again as anything but a useful source of local knowledge. I am not proud of that. I am only telling you the truth, because I think you'd know if I didn't." She looked at me for a long moment, her hand still resting on the pawn she'd moved, and something in her face shifted, not softened exactly, because I do not think Wren Calloway's face ever fully lost its watchfulness, but opened, some door I had not been sure existed swinging a little wider. "That's the first entirely honest thing a gentleman said to me since the wreck," she said. "Everyone else has been very busy telling me how brave I was and how fortunate to have been saved. No one's admitted they'd have ignored me on a Tuesday. I am admitting a great many things lately that I would not have admitted a fortnight ago," I said, and watched her go very still, and understood that we had come, without either of us quite choosing the moment, to the edge of something neither of us was yet prepared to name aloud. I should say something here of what I was, before that storm, because I do not think this account is honest if I paint myself only as the man who leapt into the sea. My father had died 4 years before, and I had inherited Fenmore along with a great deal of debt he had left carefully hidden behind an appearance of prosperity, and I had spent those 4 years being a hard and unsentimental landlord, quick to anger, slow to trust, more comfortable in a ledger than in a drawing room. The name Ironbark had been given to me first as an insult, by a rival at White's who thought I had behaved with excessive severity toward a tenant in arrears, and I had taken it up myself rather than let anyone see it wound me, until it had simply become who I was understood to be, unyielding, more wood than man. I had gone abroad that autumn to settle the last of my father's tangled affairs. a cousin's inheritance dispute in Lisbon that had taken 3 miserable months, and cost me what remained of my patience for family business conducted at a distance. And I had been returning home in a foul temper, entirely unprepared for anything so inconvenient as falling in love with a lighthouse keeper's daughter in the middle of a gale. I did not tell her all of this at once, but I told her, over the course of that fortnight, more of it than I had told anyone in years, because she had a way of asking questions that made evasion feel like cowardice, and because I had already seen her face down a storm without flinching and found I could not, in decency, offer her anything less than the truth in return. "You're not unyielding," she said to me on the 9th day, when I had told her haltingly in pieces over the course of an evening about the tenant at White's, about the temper I had earned my name defending rather than examining. "You're careful. There's a difference. I've known men who were hard because it cost them nothing. You're hard because you're afraid of what it costs if you're not." "That is either the kindest or the most damning thing anyone has ever said about me," I said, "and I cannot decide which." "Both probably," she said. "Most true things are." Her father recovered enough in that second week to sit up and take broth and eventually to ask, in a voice gone thin with illness but not with authority, exactly what a duke intended by spending a fortnight in his daughter's sick room. Josiah Calloway had been a keeper for 30 years, had buried a wife to the sea's indifference and nearly lost a daughter to it as well, and he watched me with the flat, assessing patience of a man who had long since stopped being impressed by rank, and had never once, in 30 years of tending a light for strangers' safety, been paid what the work was worth. "I mean to marry her if she'll have me," I told him, on an afternoon when Wren had gone up the tower stairs herself for the first time since the wreck, slow and stubborn, and refusing all offers of assistance, to see to the lens with her own hands. "I understand that is not the answer you expected from a man of my situation, and I understand you have every reason to doubt it, given how little most men of my situation have ever done for people in yours. I can only tell you that I have never in my life meant anything so entirely." Josiah Calloway regarded me for a long moment with eyes that had watched more storms than I would see in 3 lifetimes. "She near died doing her duty," he said at last, "same as her mother did 30 years back. I've spent every year since telling myself I'd not let the sea take a second woman from this house without a fight. I'll tell you plainly, Your Grace, if you mean to take her from this coast, you'd best understand what you're taking. She won't be made small for a title. She won't sit pretty in a drawing room and forget she can read a sky better than any admiral you've dined with. If that frightens you, best say so now and spare us both." "It doesn't frighten me," I said. "It is, I think, the whole of what I love in her. I would sooner learn to read the sky myself than ask her to stop." He studied me a moment longer, and then, unexpectedly, something in his weathered face eased into what might, in a stronger man, have been a smile. "Then you'd better ask her," he said, "and not me. I never yet managed to make that woman's daughter do a single thing she hadn't already decided for herself, and I don't imagine a duke will have better luck." I found her that evening at the top of the tower, where the great lens turned its slow, patient circle, and threw its beam out over a sea gone calm and silver under a clearing sky, the storm a fortnight gone and nearly forgotten by everyone but the 2 of us. She had her injured arm free of its sling now, though she still favored it, and she stood at the rail that ringed the lamp room with the wind pulling loose strands of hair across her face, looking out at the water the way I had come to understand. She always looked at it. Not with fear, though she had every reason for fear, but with something closer to old respect between adversaries who had taken each other's measure many times and would go on doing so for as long as she drew breath. "You climbed all this way," she said without turning, "and I know for a fact your shoulder's not fully healed either, whatever you tell Orset. You're as bad a patient as I am." "I wanted to see the light from where you see it," I said. "I've watched it from the deck of a ship in a storm and thought it the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen, because it meant the difference between wreck and safe harbor. I find I wanted to know what it looks like from this side too. She turned to face me then, and in the lamplight, that great turning beam that had guided 1,000 ships past those rocks and had, on one particular night, guided a duke's small boat's worth of hope toward the woman who tended it. I could see every mark that night had left on her, the faint scar at her hairline, the wariness that had never entirely left her eyes even when she smiled, and beneath all of it the same fierce, unbroken competence that had sent her out into a killing sea, because there was no one else to go. "I've been thinking," she said, "about what happens now. You'll go back to Fenmore eventually. Dukes have estates to run and Parliament to sit in, and I don't imagine there's much use for a lighthouse keeper's daughter in that world, whatever's passed between us here." "I've been thinking about that too," I said, "and I find I've reached a different conclusion than the one you seem to be expecting. I don't want a wife who waits in a drawing room for me to come home from managing the coast. I want a wife who can read that coast better than I ever will, who spent her whole life understanding exactly what the sea takes and what it spares, and who might, if she were willing, help me build the second light you told me Aldous Shoal has needed for a decade, so that no other keeper's daughter has to go out in a rowboat in a gale, because there was no one else to send. I am not asking you to become small enough to fit a shape you were never made for. I am asking you to marry me, and to go on being exactly the woman who terrified my crew and shamed my own courage, and made a fool of every assumption I ever carried about what a duke owes the world, and what the world owes back to him." She was silent long enough that I began, despite everything, to fear I had misjudged the moment entirely, that I had mistaken 9 days of shared danger and quiet evenings over a chessboard for something deeper than either of us had actually built. Then she stepped forward, closing the distance between us at the rail with the same unhurried, unafraid directness with which she did everything else, and put her good hand flat against my chest, over the place where I imagined she could feel my heart going entirely too fast for a man who had once been called unyielding by half of London. "You jumped into a sea that had already killed better swimmers than you," she said, "for a woman you'd never met, because you couldn't live with watching. I have spent a great deal of my life being told what I am not delicate enough, not helpless enough, not the kind of woman a man wants to protect, because I've never needed protecting the way the songs say a woman ought to need it. You are the first man who ever looked at that and called it something worth loving instead of something to be managed or excused." "It was never something to be managed," I said. "It was the truest thing I'd seen in years." "Then yes," she said, "though I'll tell you now before you've fully committed yourself, that I intend to go on climbing that tower whenever the weather turns, Duchess or not, and I will not thank you for trying to stop me." "I would not dream of it," I said, and found, when I finally kissed her there at the top of her father's tower, with the great lamp turning its slow beam out over a sea that had tried and failed to take her from the world, that I meant every word of every promise I had made her, and every one I had yet to make. We were married in the spring, in the small stone church above the village, with her father walking her down an aisle strewn with early primrose, strong enough by then to stand unaided, though he kept one hand near the pew rail throughout. Mrs. Pargeter wept openly and told anyone who would listen that she had known, from the very first day I sat too long in that creaking chair, exactly how the whole business would end. Lady Southerton attended, with considerably better grace than she had shown that first week, and brought a gift, a set of charts of the coastal waters, bound in leather, which Wren treasured more than any jewel I ever gave her. We built the second light at Aldous Shoal within 2 years, funded from Fenmore's own accounts over the objections of an agent who did not understand why his duke cared so much for a stretch of coast that was not, strictly, his own responsibility. Wren oversaw its construction herself, climbing scaffolding in weather that made my own men blanch. She never did stop climbing towers in a gale, and I never did stop worrying when she did, and I have come to understand that loving someone fiercely does not mean wishing them smaller, only wishing them safe enough to go on being exactly as large as they were always meant to be. I think of that night often, more often than I think of any other night in a life that has had its share of both triumph and grief. I think of the wave taller than the mast, and the cold that struck like a blow, and the sound of her voice arguing with the sea rather than surrendering to it. They still call me the Ironbark Duke in the drawing rooms of London, and I no longer mind the name, because I have come to understand what it means to be unyielding in service of something worth holding rather than merely something to be defended. I learned that lesson from a woman who went out into a killing storm to save strangers she would never meet, and who taught me that the truest rescue is rarely the one where a man pulls a woman from the water. The truest rescue is the one that happens after, slow and unglamorous, built from honest conversation and a chessboard, and 100 small admissions neither of us would have made to anyone else. I did not save Wren Calloway, not truly. She saved a ship full of strangers first, at a cost that nearly killed her, because it was the work in front of her and there was no one else to do it. I only happened to be close enough, and fool enough, and finally ready enough after 4 hard, unyielding years of my own, to jump in after her when the sea tried to take back what she had already given. I have never once regretted the leap, though I have grown old enough now, sitting some evenings at that same lighthouse with our own children racing along the cliff path her father once walked with a lantern in hand, to understand how thin the margin was between the story I tell now and one that ends in grief, instead of a wedding in a small stone church strewn with primrose. Wren has never had much patience for dwelling on storms that did not, in the end, take everything, and I have learned to follow her example in that as in so much else. There is one more thing I should set down, because it is the part of the story Wren always insists I tell properly. It concerns Tolliver, the assistant keeper she trained herself, the man Mrs. Pargeter mentioned that first week in the kitchen, furious from his own sickbed of worry that anyone doubted his competence to mind the light in his mistress's absence. Tolliver had been a fisherman's son with a ruined leg from a boating accident of his own, a young man the village had largely written off as unfit for the sea he loved, until Wren, then barely 18 herself, had insisted he could learn the tower work as well as any able-bodied man, since the true skill of keeping a light lay in patience and precision rather than brute strength. She had taught him herself, over her father's mild objections, and Tolliver had proven her right 100 times over, most especially on the night of the storm, when he had held the light steady through hours no fully able man could have improved upon, guiding the very ship Wren nearly died, reaching into water where its confused pilot could see enough to correct his course at the last possible moment. I did not learn the full measure of what Tolliver had done until weeks after the wedding, when I finally sat with him myself over the account books of Gull's Point, trying to understand exactly how the light had functioned through a fortnight when its 2 rightful keepers were, one deathly ill and the other nearly drowned. Tolliver was a quiet man, unused to being asked his opinion by anyone of my rank, and it took some patient coaxing before he spoke freely. She never once let anyone tell her what I couldn't do, he said, turning his hat in his hands in the front room at Fenmore, where I had invited him to dine with a bluntness that clearly unsettled him more than the meal itself. Not the Trinity men, not her own father, not the boys in the village who used to laugh at my leg before they saw what I could do with a lens and a logbook. I owe that woman everything I am, your grace, and I'll tell you plainly, if you ever give her cause to regret marrying you, you'll answer to me, Duke or no Duke. I laughed and told him I considered that an entirely fair arrangement, and meant it. We built a proper cottage for Tolliver near the new light at Aldous Shoal, and he keeps it to this day, and writes to Wren twice a year with reports on the currents and the gulls and the small triumphs of a life he had once been told he could not have. She reads every letter twice, and always writes back within the week, and I have come to understand that this too is part of what I married, not merely a woman who had saved a ship and survived a wreck, but a woman who had spent her whole life quietly insisting that people not be measured by what the world assumed they could not do, and who had, by that same stubborn grace, eventually insisted the same of me. We do not speak of the storm as often as we once did in the early years, when it still felt close enough to touch. When I would wake some nights certain, I could still feel the cold water closing over my head and would reach for her in the dark before I was even fully awake. She always woke when I did in those early years, and would simply take my hand and hold it until my own breathing matched hers again, until I remembered where and when I was safe, married, home. She never once told me to stop needing that reassurance, never once suggested a duke ought to be past such things. That, I think, more than anything else, is the measure of what she taught me in that lighthouse cottage during her recovery. That strength is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to keep going out into the storm anyway, when the work demands it, and the equal willingness, afterward, to let someone else hold you steady while the shaking passes. Wren says I give the sea too much credit, that it was never the storm that changed me, only the woman in it, and that I ought to stop thanking a body of water for what was, in the end, entirely her own doing, her courage in going out that night, her stubbornness in surviving the wreck, her patience in teaching a hard, careful duke that gentleness was not the same as weakness. I tell her she is, as in most things, almost certainly right, and that I intend to go on thanking the sea regardless, because it was there, that night, at the one moment in my life when I most needed to become someone worth loving, and it did not, in the end, take her from me. She rolls her eyes at me when I say things like that. She has been rolling her eyes at me for the better part of 20 years now, and I have come to consider it one of the great privileges of my life, to be a man whose wife has never once been afraid to tell him plainly when he is being sentimental. I would not trade this life, this house above the sea, this woman who still climbs a tower in a gale because the work demands it, and because she has never once needed anyone's permission to be exactly as brave as she was born to be, for anything the world tried to tell me in my careful, unyielding years, that a duke was owed instead. The light still turns above Gull's Point, patient and steady, exactly as it did on the night the storm took her boat and very nearly took her, and I have never once, in all the years since, watched that beam sweep out over the water without thinking of the woman who first taught me what it meant to be saved, not lifted from danger by another's strength alone, but met there, in the worst of it, by someone willing to hold on until the dawn came. That, in the end, is the whole of what I know to be true. The sea took her boat that night and came very near to taking her, and in reaching for her I found I had lost nothing of myself worth keeping and gained everything I had not known. Until that moment I was missing. I would swim that same black water 1,000 times over for the same result, if it meant I got to come home, every evening of my life, to the woman who taught an Ironbark duke how to bend.